Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry and uses the imaginary Ersatz coffee shop as its platform to bring you a conversation about a plethora of scintillating topics. We don't shy away from any issue that is plaguing our culture or the church today, whether it's current cultural issues, questions about Bible verses, or even just some banter to encourage you. Dr. Jay Christensen is the Truth Barista, and he and amazing Larry Kutzler brew up highly caffeinated conversations for our day. Grab a cup of joe, plop yourself down in the booth next to us, and get ready to think. The Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry, and it's listener supported. For more information about the Truth Barista, go to highbeamministry.com. Thanks for listening.
There are innumerable ways that civilizations and their peoples can vanish from history. Sometimes natural catastrophes are to blame, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, plagues. But the moments that have resonated through history are the destructions of countries and cultures by warfare. The brutal fates of Thebes, Carthage, Constantinople, and the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan stand as a warning to the modern world, America included, that it is hardly immune from the tragedies of the past. From the vantage point of the 21st century, the idea of military obliteration can seem impossible. Those before us who faced the end of everything had the same reaction. Technology may have changed, but human nature is no different now than it was years ago. The Thebans, the Carthaginians, the Byzantines, and the Aztecs were annihilated by weapons that are now obsolete. But the agendas of destruction persist to this day, and only the methods of genocide, nuclear, chemical, and biological, are more advanced and at our fingertips. We have much to learn from those who were destroyed by war, particularly because the old mentalities and delusions that doomed them still are very much with us, especially the last thoughts of the slaughtered. It cannot happen here.
If you look at Malachi talks about right before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. He said that you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the righteous and the wicked. Why is that? In other words, there is a very famous minister in the 20th century who made a prophetic word. Her name was Amy Sibley McPherson. She said, "In the final days, I see the righteous and the wicked worshiping God together in the same house." Now, what Malachi goes on to say is that the fire of God, the refining, is going to separate truly those who serve God and those who don't. And I'm just wondering, with what's happening today, if there are not a lot of people who are identifying as being Jesus followers, but yet Jesus said the true way we would know them is by their fruit. And when you look at people who are now arguing for abortion, for the right to take a human life under any circumstance, I don't think that's the fruit of somebody who is a Jesus follower. If you just look at Jesus, he said, you'll know a true believer by their actions, by what they're saying, by their actions. And I think it's just we're living in a day where you got to realize there's going to be a lot of people that identify as being believers that just aren't. And Paul the Apostle said that. He said in the last days, he said very difficult times are going to come. And then he starts listing all this stuff that's going to happen. People are going to be selfish. They're going to love pleasure more than God. They're going to be backbiters. They're going to be gossipers. They're going to profess a faith in Jesus, a faith in God, but they're going to deny him by the way they live.
Dr. J, always a pleasure. Here we are again in the book of Revelation, and we are going to sit before a throne today, for a while anyway. And I have so many questions when we go into his courtroom, and I'm sure you'll get to them, and I'm sure you'll have an answer.
Well, I'll certainly try. I mean, it's my job, to have at least some answers, so I'll do my best.
I love stumping you, though. I mean, that's the joy of my life. In fact, I go to bed at night and go, how am I going to stump the Truth Barista, Dr. J. Christensen? And, sometimes, I come up with one, but usually you have an answer, so there you go.
Well, I try, and all kidding aside, we don't know all of the answers to the questions that are there in the Bible. It's up to us to kind of ferret them out as best we can. And so that's what we're going to try to do. So let's head into it. Let's do a little bit of a recap here in chapter 19. We saw the celebration in heaven now that the beast and the false prophet have been thrown into the lake of fire. And then we see the rider on the white horse coming down, and he's defeating his armies and all that stuff. Then we see the beast and its armies defeated at the end there. We just talked about that. Then when we get into chapter 20, there's a big wrap up. And when we say wrap up, it means an angel comes down from heaven and wraps up Satan in a chain and throws him in a pit for 1,000 years to get him out of the way, to keep him out of influencing the world for 1,000 years while Jesus reigns. And as we talked about the last time, there is some guessing, could be, or deduction, that there will be glorified people living on the earth and there will be non-glorified people living on the earth, because it does talk about babies being born and people dying. So it's one of those, I'm not going to die on this hill. It's just a supposition based on the text that I read in Isaiah and other places regarding the heavens. After that, or during that time, the saints, the glorified saints, are going to be reigning with Jesus on the throne. And then after the 1,000 years, Satan will be released to have one more run at domination. And he's going to actually pull together this remarkable army from around the earth. And I think it's going to be those people who have never known temptation or have never been deceived. And he'll get these people together. And basically Jesus is going to say to us, okay, now stand back, I got this. And it's a total wipeout, and we see the satanic rebellion crushed, and Satan is thrown into the lake of fire along with the beast and the false prophet. And then we get to the great white throne judgment, and that's where we stopped last week. So let's start with verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and one seated on it. Earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. I also saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the books. Then the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Each one was judged according to their works. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. All right, now go with your questions.
In the very first verse there in chapter 20, verse 11, it says, the earth and the sky fled from his presence. That's the expanse of the sky and the earth. What does it mean they fled from his presence?
Well, it could be that at this point, God gets them out of the way, and I don't know how he's going to do it, but really the point of that verse is there is no place for the wicked to hide.
So it's really the wicked, not necessarily when it says the sky and the earth fled. It means people who are living on the earth.
Well, here, this is another important point. I'm going to dip into something. When you go back to the Old Covenant, within the Old Covenant, God says, I call heaven and earth to testify against you as witnesses that you have affirmed this covenant, and if you break it, they will testify against you. Now, why did God choose heaven and earth to stand as witnesses to the Old Covenant? Because heaven and earth are perpetual. So they're always there. So it's like in a marriage, having those, the best man and the maid of honor standing with the bridal couple. And anytime there's a dispute and they want to break up, the witnesses step forward and say, we saw you make these vows. You got to hang in there. So in a sense, when heaven and earth are dismissed at this point, on one hand, you can say, now it's time for judgment against those who have broken God's covenant. Number two, if the old covenant is over, you no longer need the witnesses, so you can dismiss them. Now, let me dig a little deeper in here. Are we talking about humanity being judged under the old covenant? No, we're not. But there was a covenant made with Adam and Eve, a creation covenant. And the covenant was, number one, I'm your God, you're my people. That was implied in their creation. And then he said, subdue and rule the earth and populate it. So that's the commands that come under that covenant. And the third command, which was a negative command, was don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, you can't make your own moral decisions. You have to rely on the king to tell you what's right and what's wrong. So under the creation covenant that Adam and Eve were in, they had to subdue and rule the earth. They had to have babies, but they could only live life God's way and let him call the shots. So in a sense, has humanity broken covenant with the Lord? Absolutely. When Adam and Eve sinned, they broke the covenant and they were under the judgment of death. Now, under the new covenant, because all the other covenants in between are basically rehashes of the original covenant, but under the new covenant with Jesus, Jesus takes the punishment of death for us. So now we can avoid that punishment. What we're seeing here at the Great White Throne Judgment is God looking at the wicked saying, you have not taken hold of the new covenant. You're still under the punishment of the creation covenant. You have sinned. You have not repented. You must die, which means you will be separated from me. And in the meantime, you will experience this judgment of the lake of fire. So the Great White Throne Judgment, I don't think that's Jesus. I think that's God the Father himself, because we see that same throne in Daniel chapter 7, and we see that same throne in Revelation 4 and 5. It's the Ancient of Days, the Father who sits on the throne. At the beginning of the millennial kingdom, when Jesus returns, he returns as a judge and he returns as a king. So he judges first and he takes up his throne. From that point on, he rules for 1,000 years. And then it says in scripture that when all of this is wrapped up, he turns dominion back to his Father. And then his Father, from the Great White Throne Judgment, executes judgment on all of those who refused to come to him through the new covenant and swear allegiance to him, with Jesus as the sacrifice that seals that covenant. When Jesus was on the cross, he was the one who took the punishment for us. And as the Son of Man who returns, he comes as the judge on behalf of his Father, the ultimate king. So we see that in Daniel 7, and we see that in Revelation 4 and 5. Then Jesus reigns as king, but really the one who has the ultimate say at the end, who the previous two verses says sits on the throne, I see it as the Father. And so he's the one who is the ultimate judge rather than Jesus, because he, in a sense, would point to Jesus and say, Jesus is the sacrifice. Did you allow that sacrifice to stand in your place? If not, guilty as charged, boom, sent into death row, which is the lake of fire.
Yeah.
Now, something else that's interesting about this here is this is called the second death. So the people who are wicked have died physically and are separated from humanity by being in what we call hell or Sheol. This is the holding place of the dead. And somehow they are resurrected at the end, like the righteous are resurrected. So they stand before the Father in a resurrected body, soul, and spirit. But think of how horrible this is. Now you have a body that will experience the lake of fire as opposed to being disembodied. Anyway, so we're kind of getting into the weeds there, but what I'm seeing is they're judged according to their works. And since our works cannot get us back into a relationship with God other than having that relationship with Jesus, they're automatically disqualified. They're done. Now, it does say that some of the people who have never heard of Jesus, Paul says they'll be judged by their consciences. And so this may be one of those things where, are they judged at their conscience here, or will they be brought into heaven when they die and God judges them and accepts them into heaven initially because of their conscience? What we do know, and by the way, I think it's more the latter, I do know that God says if people have not heard the gospel, God will judge them righteously, and there will be no misjudgment on the Father's part. Everybody will get what they have earned. The wicked here are not going to like what they've earned.
I wonder if this day will not be a happy day at all, obviously, because they are being shown what they did with their lives. And it's not going to be pretty, because all of the things that they have done throughout their whole life will be up on the big screen. So there are two books then. I always thought there were two books. The one book, here's what you did with your life. And good or bad, here's what it is. And then the second book is the book of life. Is your name, and that's really what judges them to go into that second death of the lake of fire. It's not a pretty thing. Sometimes we think, well, I feel sorry for people. I really do. When we witness about the good news of Jesus and the gospel that keeps us from this moment happening, because when we accept Christ, we will not be in front of that throne. Am I correct on that?
You are correct, sir. We will not stand before the great white throne. Our judgment comes at the time at the time Jesus returns, because this is when he gives the rewards to people. And for us, we don't get judged regarding salvation and life with the Lord eternal. We get judged, according to 1 Corinthians 3, on what we've done with our lives. Well, the wicked also get judged according to what they've done with their lives. Primary thing is, what have you done with your life regarding giving it over to the Lord or not? That's a salvation issue. If they haven't, then they get judged on their works, but we know that works won't get you into heaven, so they're going into the lake of fire and everything gets burned up. That's the really sad part of this. But we are going to move into another section here after the wicked have been put in the lake of fire, and you see the Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet are also in the lake of fire. So a lot of stuff is getting burnt up at this point. In fact, it's the place where sin goes. So you could say that the lake of fire is the incinerator. Now, yes. Here's another thing while you're groaning over there on the other side. Notice it also says in verse 14, death and Hades were thrown in the lake of fire. What does that mean? Death is that active work of sin in our lives. Because we sin, we're separated from God. Well, since all of that source of sin and all sinners are gone, then there's no more need for death, because the only people left are those who will live forever. So the whole aspect of death, all of its consequences, thrown away, burned up. Plus, there's no more reason to have Hades, the holding place of the dead, because there will be no more death. So boom, that gets destroyed. Now what we have in chapter 21 and 22 is the wrap up. Now we're just focusing on those who are alive in the Lord. So let's just take a look at this first section here, 21, 1 through 8. And it says this, lots of good stuff here. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, talking about this great white throne. Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away. Then the one seated on the throne said, Look, I am making everything new. And he also said, Write, because these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and Omega. Okay, right there. Then he says, I am the Alpha and Omega. This is Jesus speaking. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will freely give to the thirsty from the spring of the water of life. The one who conquers will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But the cowards, faithless, detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. There are going to be a lot of politicians. Okay. Their share will be in the lake of fire that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death we just read about in the previous chapter. And boy, do you have a smirk on your face.
Wow. Talk about commentary in the middle of Bible study or reading the scripture.
Well, a lot of people, based on that scripture verse, a lot of people say, well, there's a special place in hell for some of these politicians.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing. Okay, I will give you that. But what what about all the preachers that are probably not exactly kosher? What about those guys and gals,
Well, it applies to anybody. I
There
mean,
you
look at
go.
that list. It's,
Yeah.
cowards.
Yeah.
And cowards in the face of those who repudiate Jesus in the face of persecution. Remember, this is what John is talking about. This is his context. The book of Revelation is about perseverance under persecution. So cowards is at the top of the list. Then there are the faithless, those who refuse to believe in God, detestable people, murderers, of course. That's the top of the Big Ten, right? Sexually immoral, that's also in the Ten Commandments. Sorcerers and idolaters, those who turn their back on God and embrace the other side of the spiritual spectrum. And liars, their share will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Let me explain some stuff as we begin to wrap up today, and I'll get into a little bit deeper stuff next week. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. There are two words for new that are used kind of interchangeably throughout the New Covenant scriptures. The first word is neos. Neos means brand new. So, for example, if a teacher graduates from college with an educational degree and a certificate in teaching, she becomes a new teacher. She's never taught before, but she's a new teacher. Now, let's say there's a teacher who's been in a different school district for, say, 10 years, and she transfers to another school district. She's still a teacher, has been teaching, but now she is a new teacher. It doesn't mean she's brand new. It just means that there's been a change that makes her, with air quotes, new. The word here, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, is that second new. It's kainos, which means new out of something that existed previously. So God is not creating a new heaven and a new earth out of nothing. He's taking the heavens and the earth and he is remaking them. Why? He's going to eliminate all stain of sin and corruption that were in the previous earth that was introduced by sin. So he is taking creation and he is, in a sense, mashing it together and remaking it so that there is no influence of sin. There is no negative stuff that's going on. So, for example, what about hurricanes? What about tornadoes? What about earthquakes? What about volcanoes? We didn't hear about any of that stuff in Genesis 1 and 2. But after we get into the world of sin in Genesis 3, it starts talking about storms. It talks about whirlwinds. It talks about cataclysms that happen to the earth. Prior to that, in Genesis 1 and 2, it says that the world was a very stable environment, almost like it was in a terrarium, where the mists came up out of the ground and waters the land gently, as opposed to massive storms ripping through, dropping hailstones and flooding everything out. So I'm thinking this new heaven and new earth, God is remaking it to the way he originally designed it. So it's like Eden, a more divinely controlled environment that's perfect for the humanity he created. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's great. That's great hope. I mean, what you just spoke in, 4 or 5 minutes there is all hope, all hope. Well, by the way, the church is no longer, right? Because the church era, the era of grace is over. So there is no church. Am I correct at this point?
Right. Right. But when we get to the Messianic reign, there are those people who are in the body of Christ, and I believe those who are still mortal. But once we get to this point, it's only the people of God. Mm-hmm. Jews and Gentiles together are one new humanity, and they all have equal standing before God. We all are originally as created. Now, the last thing I want to say here is it says the first earth had passed away and the sea was no more. That word is protos, which means the first in succession. So now that the old earth passes away and is being remade new, now you have the next earth in heaven in succession here. So that's what God is doing. He's remaking the world for a humanity he's remade in Jesus.
And there's no sea, right? There's no water in, like we know, the 7 seas. They're not around, right? I'm trying to imagine what it's going to look like to, walk in the area where there is now sea. It's going to be absolutely incredible.
Well, and think of this. This is what it was in Genesis 1 and 2, as far as we can understand. It says there were no oceans, there were rivers, because water that condensed collected, but there are no seas. We don't get seas until the flood hits, and it says the fountains of the deep burst forth. I just read a science article the other day that says they have found vast oceans of water under the crust of the earth that are hundreds of kilometers deep. And you're going, how did that water get there? Well, it could be that it always was there.
Wow.
It's how did the water get up here? That's the question, and it appears to be answered in Noah's flood.
Well, Dr. J, it's been great. We'll have to hold the audience at bay for another week until we finalize what we're going to talk about here as we conclude the book of Revelation. And speaking about what we will say, next week you will hear Dr. J. Christensen say this.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Well, what's he saying? In a nutshell, God is remaking what he made originally, but had become corrupted because of sin. Now, it's kind of like he's mushing it all together and he recreates it and he goes, there, now you have a heaven and earth that's free from any sort of corruption of sin. Verse 2, I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem. That word new, kainos. In other words, it's not a completely new Jerusalem. It is a remade Jerusalem. In other words, a fit habitation for the people who want to dwell with God and the God who wants to dwell with his people. And it's coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband, which if you look at it Hebraically, this is a match made in heaven. In other words, this is a habitation where God and his people can dwell together in an intimate, open relationship with nothing to hide. Again, we're back into the language of Eden. Verse 3, then I heard a loud voice from the throne, look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now, this has always been God's plan. He created humanity to be with him. Humanity turned their backs on him, and he has been in hot pursuit of humanity to bring them back into the family over the millennia.
Well, we are closing in on the book of Revelation, and if you're interested in learning more about the Truth Barista or going back to the very beginning of our study in the book of Revelation, all of the episodes are free, and you download them, use them alongside your reading of the book of Revelation. Just go to highbeamministry.com. That's highbeamministry.com.
The Truth Barista is a listener-supported ministry that depends on the gifts of listeners like you. Please consider a gift to this Christ-honoring ministry today. Please include the station call letters, or if you're listening online, go to highbeamministry.com. That is highbeamministry.com. While you're on the website, check out all the ministry resources that are available. The blog, the Cruisin' Through the Bible commentary series, online classes, and don't forget to subscribe. We want to keep you informed about all the new series that we create for radio and the podcasts. Remember, we like feedback, so send us an email at highbeamministry.com. The Truth Barista, teaching God's Word as truth for faith and practice. Join us again next week for a cup of God's truth on The Truth Barista.
Do you want the truth today? Dr. J. Christensen is the Truth Barista and the founder of High Beam Ministry. Jay is a creative person who wants to use the setting of an imaginary cafe to produce a series of radio and internet programs that confront the issues of our day through the lens of the Bible. The Truth Barista was the avenue that was developed to communicate truth using the Bible as the source of our information. The Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry and can be found online at highbeamministry.com.